Welcome back to Tipton Bros. Today, we'll be discussing the Indian Urumi, lovingly referred to as the whip sword. Origin, usage, and effectiveness in combat will be covered. Now, let's get into it. This peculiar blade hails from the southwestern tip of India, on the Malabar coast, in what is today the state of Kerala. The Urumi was conceived between the 1st and 4th century BCE, with its invention being attributed to the Maurya Empire, although several sources broadly point to the early Sangam period. Frequently labeled as the Shutuval in the Malayalam language, this translates to English as coiled sword. The Urumi, while rooted in combat, instead draws its acclaim from martial arts, specifically the Indian fighting style of Kalari Payatu, which is deeply tied to Hindu scripture. According to the Vedas, Lord Vishnu's disciple Parasurama descended to earth as a worldly incarnation, the 6th avatar of Vishnu, to teach the people about Kalari Payatu, so they may better protect their land. Parasurama is considered the father of this ancient tradition. The Urumi is also employed by practitioners of Silambam, another renowned Indian martial art, and Angampora, a Sri Lankan form of self-defense. Now, to establish the basics. For all intents and purposes, the Urumi is a flexible double-edged steel whip. Generally, the brass or iron hilt consisted of a knuckle guard and sizable disc pommel to protect the user's hand. The blade, or blades, depending on the pattern, were no more than 1 inch or 2.5 centimeters wide and composed of pressed, thin metal sheets. 6 feet or 2 meters is the standard length, with some Urumi variants spanning up to 5 meters or 17 feet. The whipsword is commonly equipped with 1 to 3 blades per hilt, although the Sri Lankan variation boasts up to 32. Of course, there must be a point of diminishing returns regarding the number of blades on a given sword. At what point does an instrument become a spectacle? That I cannot tell you. The Shutuval was stored in a tight coil on the hip, and depending on preference, wrapped around the user's waist. Only select master practitioners of Kalari Payatu were authorized to carry the Urumi, as it posed a real threat to others and its wielder if operated improperly. Consequently, the teaching of the Shutuval is done with extreme caution, giving eager students long strips of cloth to mirror the whip's movement. In practice, the Urumi is dependent upon momentum, and thus its controller must remain fluid and devoid of hesitancy. This can be achieved through 2 distinct pathways. The first and most prevalent is a figure 8, looping the blade from one side of the body to the other in a Lemniscan-esque style. This seems to be particularly effective when dual-wielding the weapon. The second option is much simpler, the classic over-the-head approach, twirling the Urumi in a circular pattern in the air. Obviously, handling the Shutuval is far more complex than I have described, but these 2 fundamental techniques are the building blocks to true mastery. Finally, could the whip sword hold its own in combat? As with most historical conclusions, the answer lies in an unsatisfactory middle. The Urumi was certainly an intimidating sidearm with imposing range, able to keep numerous opponents at bay. Slicing loudly through the air, the Shutuval was best suited to those intermediate to long-distance engagements. Space is the user's friend. The whipsword could wrap around an adversary's stall, a buckler or shield, and inflict deep lacerations, especially if that individual lacked proper protection, which was often the case. On the other hand, that same space that afforded the Urumi energy is the catalyst for its downfall. At any given time, a Shutuval wielder needs a 15 to 20 yard circumference to avoid injuring his or her comrades. Furthermore, if that momentum is halted, the blade entangled, or the enemy merely enters close quarters, you may as well be holding a tape measure. So, while the whipsword is an infamous and captivating instrument with rich heritage, it is highly specialized and therefore not a great choice of primary weapon. I hope you've enjoyed today's brief overview of the Indian Urumi. A like is greatly appreciated, and recommendations are always welcome for future videos. Until next time on Tipton Bros.